Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Harvard professor of economics and former Bush administration official, Greg Mankiw, who's going to explain economics to us here
Nice to be here.
in an hour and a half. So what's going on? I mean, 45% of the American public in 2016 voted for either Bernie Sanders, a socialist, or Donald Trump, whatever he is, a certain kind of populist, who reject, both of whom reject, I would say, a lot of the mainstream claims of mainstream economics. Are things so bad? I mean, is the country in such bad shape that people are right to sort of turn to more extreme, I guess we could say, policies and solutions? And what does it say about the country? And then we'll talk about what does it say about maybe about economics.
Sure. I mean, well, the first thing to say is that the United States remains one of the richest countries in the world, so that you don't want to lose sight of that fact. But there are a couple very troubling trends that I think make people unhappy for good reason. One is that if you look at growth rates, they've been slowly trending downward over time. So the past, say, 15 years is the lowest 15-year growth rate that we've seen since World War II. So you have to go back to the Great Depression to really find a period this bad. So we have very low long-term growth rates. In addition, we see rising inequality. So the growth we have seen has accrued to people at the top of the income distribution, and people who are less educated, people with, say, high school degrees or high school dropouts, have seen really very little advances in their wages in 20, 30 years.
So that's true.
That's absolutely true.
That's not just sort of...
Those are real facts about the data. Now, there's a question of how you interpret that data, what's causing it, what should policy do about it. And I think those are harder questions, but the fact that we are in a low growth regime and a rising inequality era are unfortunate facts.
So in that respect, I guess if one came down from Mars and looked and he said, we're going to have a big recession, big financial crisis followed by a big recession in 2007, 8, 9, and one that was not predicted probably by a lot of the elites and experts, so a little discrediting, you might say, to their claims, and 20 years or 30 years of flat incomes for a lot of Americans, and the annoyance, maybe it's apparent injustice, maybe, of the growing inequality. It's not, maybe one should have predicted a Sanders and a Trump phenomenon in 2016.
Yeah, no, I think people have real reasons to be unhappy about certain developments in the economy. Then the question is whether the Sanders-Trump solutions and diagnosis of the problem is correct. And there I'm more skeptical. But I think that the fact that there are macroeconomic trends that are leaving people, especially less educated working class people, unhappy, I think makes perfect sense.
And how much of this is due to forces beyond anyone's control and that you don't really couldn't and wouldn't want to turn around, technology and stuff, and how much of it is sort of policy driven, do you think?
Well, I think a lot of it is beyond people's control. I mean, one of the books about slow growth that's gotten a lot of attention over the past couple of years is by Robert Gordon from Northwestern University. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And his explanation is that it's primarily technological, that previous generations we saw technological innovations that really promoted rising living standards that were incredible. We saw electrification, the internal combustion engine, indoor plumbing, and these really changed people's lives fundamentally. We have technological progress now, he says, but it's not fundamentally as life-changing as the technological progress of previous generations. Yeah, we have 140 characters, but if you had to give up your 140-character Twitter account versus indoor plumbing, you wouldn't have any difficult choosing. So his view is we're just not seeing the kind of technological change that we've seen in previous generations. And maybe, I don't know if that's right, but I think it's a plausible hypothesis.
And does he argue, do you think that that's maybe just we had this amazing, 50, 80 years, 100 years industrial revolution, and you just get a massive wave of revolutions in transportation and public health and et cetera.
I think that's right.
That's just not going to happen again. Maybe this was just the one time in human history we're going to get, that level of progress, and now we're going to go back to something slower. Is that possible?
I think that is his hypothesis. He thinks, it's truly true if you go back in human history 2,000 years, stagnant living standards is the norm.
Right.
Before the Industrial Revolution, sort of things didn't really change all that much in terms of average living standards. And his view is that the Industrial Revolution doesn't mean we're going to grow at 3% forever. It was a period of time of rapid growth, and maybe we're getting down to something more normal. We're still growing, but at a slower pace. Now, the future is very, very hard to predict, and economists are terrible at that. So I think Gordon has sort of more credibility in terms of looking at the recent past than he does at predicting the future. And who knows whether bioengineering and so on is going to have huge changes going forward, maybe.
That's true.
So I'm less willing to sign on to Bob's fairly sad prediction than I am his diagnosis of what's been happening recently.
And how worried are you about the reaction to this fact, let's call it the wage stagnation and stuff? I mean, politically, will it make things worse? Or?
Well, absolutely. I think a lot of the diagnosis of the general public and some of the leading political candidates, I think, is basically wrong. So, for example, let's take trade.
Yeah, let's take trade, because that's been such a big one. You had the phenomenon of just review for a second. So Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, negotiates a trade agreement with 12 Asian nations, walks away from it under pressure from Sanders, who's against it, and the left wing of the Democratic Party, and the Republicans, which have been pretty consistently free trade entirely in terms of presidential candidates. Romney had supported this agreement and so forth, McCain, and they both continue to do so. And most of the candidates do so, get defeated by Trump. So the first non-free trade Republican to be nominated in modern times, really, right? So it's pretty amazing when you think about it. All of us, to have Hillary Clinton walking away from an agreement she negotiated under pressure from Sanders, and Trump winning the Republican nomination. So the trade seems to be a big one in terms of the either temporarily or not, change in the public attitude.
I continue to believe that the basic lessons that we teach students in introductory economics classes, which I teach at Harvard, are basically right. And trade is, in fact, one of the things we spend a lot of time in my class talking to students about. And the lessons are, which I think are surprising to some laymen, are basically the following. One is that trade between countries is not zero sum, that it can make both countries better off. And so we shouldn't think of trade with China, say, as being a competition with China, that really both countries can be made better off. Secondly, trade doesn't mean that necessarily everybody in any country wins, because domestic producers and domestic consumers of any particular good may have different interests.
Right.
And so when we start importing cheap textiles from China or some other country, domestic consumers are better off because they get to buy things more cheaply. But if you're a domestic textile producer, a worker in a textile plant, you may lose your job. And so while the overall size of the pie is going to expand, as the U.S. is richer overall, there are going to be some people who are worse off. And that is absolutely correct. And that is probably a contributing factor to some of the wage stagnation for certain groups of people that we've seen. I should say, by the way, to go back to the issue of inequality, while I think that trade is a contributing factor, I don't think it's the dominant factor on rising inequality. And so let's talk about that. I think we can come back to trade.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you want to say why are we becoming less equal, the best explanation for that is a book by two of my Harvard colleagues, Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, and their book is called The Race Between Education and Technology. And their story is that there's usually two forces driving inequality. Technology tends to exacerbate inequality because when we invent new production processes, that tends to replace unskilled workers and makes the skilled workers more productive. And education is the other side of that ledger, where it turns unskilled workers into skilled workers. And their view is that up to the 1970s, say, education was winning the race. We had this big advance in educational attainment, things like the GI Bill generation. And as a result, while technology may have been increasing the demand for skilled workers, the educational system was increasing the supply of them even faster. Since then, things have reversed. Educational attainment has plateaued. We haven't seen big advances in educational attainment since the 1970s. And as a result, technology has been winning that race. So it's been increasing the demand for skilled workers and increasing inequality, leaving a lot of unskilled workers behind as they get replaced by machines. Now, to get back to trade is a little bit like technology, right? If you're a factory worker with, say, a high school degree,
Right.
it's kind of the same thing whether you're replaced by a Chinese worker overseas or you're replaced by a domestic robot here. They're both basically producing something more cheaply that you used to produce with unskilled labor before.
I mean, economic theory, obviously correct me, it would be that, but there's more there's a net benefit to the economy. There's more, consumers are all saving money on this cheaper textiles, to get back to your earlier example, they're buying. So some textile workers are put out of work, and there's a temporary dislocation, but that money got to go somewhere, so that textile worker presumably becomes a different kind of worker who supplies some other good, which this larger economy would be demanding, right? In theory.
No, that's exactly right. But the transition from one sector to another sector can be painful. So 200 years ago, most Americans were farmers. Right? Now, less than 2% of Americans are farmers. that's a good thing because all those people who are,
Right.
we now produce all the food we need plus export some with very few people because advances in agricultural technology has made that possible. That's clearly a good thing for our prosperity. It would be terrible if 80% of Americans were farmers today.
Right.
But the transition from going from being a farmer to going to being something else is painful as people make that transition over the lifetimes or across generations. And we're seeing the same thing now with manufacturing workers. One of the questions I often ask audiences is, when did manufacturing output peak in the United States? And everybody always says 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And the answer is like right now. We're producing more manufacturing output than we ever have before. If you look at manufacturing employment, that peaked 20 or 30 years ago. And that sort of shows you the nature of the problem. We're producing lots of stuff, but with
Right.
fewer and fewer workers. And that's primarily technology.
And that's a good thing, especially because this is one thing I don't like in the kind of current debate is there's so much nostalgia for the good old days, working, people had these jobs, and there's some truth to that, and especially the unionized jobs paid well, and they were stable for maybe 20, 30 years and so forth. I think it was really great that people were working in coal mines and, getting sick at age 43 with, black lung disease. And I seem to remember, I'm old enough to remember a whole literature about how alienating working on assembly lines was. And it wasn't stupid literature. It's not great, it's not either physically great for you, but also, sort of spiritually maybe to be putting some, doing the same thing for 8 hours a day.
Right.
So, I mean, that was sort of an old-fashioned view that had some credibility, that it was not a bad thing that we were inventing technology that was liberating people from these jobs. But I guess it didn't work out quite the way people hoped in terms of them being able to easily get other jobs. Are there problems in the labor market, do you think? I mean, what could be, done about that? I mean,
I think the real problem is in the educational system. Because I think what we need is more skilled workers, because that's where we're transitioning to, is a more skilled economy. If you look at sort of growing sectors, and manufacturing is shrinking, what's growing? Higher education is growing, healthcare is growing. But to get those kinds of jobs typically require more years of schooling. And so what we need to do is think about education in order so that education can start winning their race between education and technology. Turn back to that Golden and Katz book. So I think a lot of the focus really needs to be on how to get more people through high school and more people into college. And that's a hard problem. I don't have any great answers for that, but I think that's in the long run where the focus needs to be.
so it's a human capital issue, so to speak.
It is. I mean, going back to the farmers. If 200 years ago, we told policymakers at the time, we're only going to need 2% of the population being farmers rather than the 80% that we had then, and say, oh my God, what those other 78% of the people are going to do?
Right.
And trying to say, let's figure out ways to keep them on the farm wouldn't be the right answer. We got to figure out how to transition them into the next thing. That's easier to do in the long run, from generation to generation.
Right.
It's much harder to do if you're the 50-year-old worker who's had a job that you thought was going to be stable, and all of a sudden you're replaced by a robot or a cheaper worker abroad.
And I suppose the unhappiness compounds if you yourself don't have great prospects and you're going to work at a job you don't like that much for the next final 15 years of your working life, and you're worried that your kids aren't going to have better prospects, right? I mean,
Yes.
You can, in a way, absorb the hit perhaps to your generation if you're confident that the farmer was confident that his kids who would move to the city were going to do better or something like that.
I mean, we need to get the kids ready for a different kind of job. I mean, the one thing that's going to happen fairly soon, I'm guessing, is driverless cars and driverless trucks. Imagine you're a truck driver. You spend your life as a truck driver, and you're 50 years old, and all of a sudden they say, we don't need you anymore. We now have a driverless truck. That could happen in our lifetimes. That's not going to be an easy transition. You're not going to immediately turn that truck driver into something we need, like a home health care worker. His kids could be trained as home health care workers, but turning the 50-year-old is much harder.
But you do read about the decline of labor market mobility, isn't that right? I mean, that somehow people used to adjust faster and move places where there were jobs? Is that true, or?
I've seen evidence to that. I mean, I think we need to figure out ways to increase mobility and allow people to move from states to states. I mean, it's funny, a lot of public policies are place-based, which means if you see a poor area, how can we make that poor area successful?
Right.
A lot of economists are skeptical of those place-based policies and rather have person-based policies.
Right.
They say, okay, how do we get the person to move to where opportunity is? Four of my grandparents were born in Ukraine. Thankfully, they left to come to the United States. That's probably the best thing for my economic success. we could have spent the past century saying how can we make Ukraine successful, but it's pretty clear for the Mankiw family that leaving Ukraine was the right way to go.
Right. Well, I'm sure it was a detriment to the people in the UK that left. But yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, it's so much easier to write the dramatic story of the decline of Detroit. Isn't it horrible? It has only 1/3 the people it used to have, and it is kind of bad for some people. And you look at the deserted buildings, and that's not nice. On the other hand, it wouldn't have been a favor to the hundreds of thousands of people who left Detroit to have made them stay there,
Right,
I mean,
absolutely.
they're probably doing pretty well, a lot of them in
Yes.
in Phoenix or, Florida or something like that, and
Yes.
and that I do think that is a big problem, and of course politically that's a problem because we have a place-based political system. if you
Yeah,
wanna put it
place-based
that way.
politicians, right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. If you're a congressman saying, oh, I've helped my constituents leave my district,
Right.
and now they're doing successful in somebody else's district, that doesn't get you reelected. So we probably see more place-based policies for that reason.
But trade, so I mean, trade, I think I've seen studies studies with political, science kind of things, that public opinion polls. Trade really was one of Trump's key issues. He clearly thinks it was, and I kind of
yes.
agree with that. That I mean, it really hit a chord. I think if people went to speeches, I'd say from the outside, someone like me thought, well, he has a million different issues: immigration, no wars. I mean, various issues. Most of them I don't like, but nonetheless that were popular. But I think trade was the one that really hit a chord in a lot of America, somewhat to my surprise in a sense, and I think to economists' surprise because it's not that much a part of the economy.
Actually, it's
right?
somewhat to common surprise. There's a
Okay,
book.
so tell me about that. Yeah.
There's a book, maybe 10 years ago now, called "The Myth of the Rational Voter" by Brian Kaplan, which is wonderful about going through a lot of biases that people have about how the world works. I mean, economists spend a lot of time thinking about these public policy issues, but most people have busy lives and spend most of their time thinking about other things. But they do have certain assumptions about how the world works. And one of the things Kaplan does in this book is studies the various biases that people have. And two of the biases he finds, first there's an anti-foreign bias. People are skeptical about interactions with foreigners, and that's because some interactions with foreigners are not productive. It's, wars, for example.
Right.
So there's a certain natural skepticism about foreigners. And the other thing he documents is an anti-market bias. People tend not to trust market mechanisms for getting things right. And those two biases sort of come together in trade. So people sort of look at the China, which is doing very well in the past 20 years, and say, China's doing great. They must be doing great at my expense. And economists don't think that, but it's not a crazy thing for a layman who doesn't spend time thinking about these issues to believe to be true.
Yeah, I always sometimes say in speeches, that it's a problem that China's, growing so fast. It's a geopolitical problem in some ways, strategic problem, but also it could be an economic challenge. On the other hand, we would prefer a world with a China that's doing well than a China that's doing horribly, I think. That really is a recipe for disaster, right? Same with Mexico.
Absolutely.
I mean, do we want Mexico to be falling apart, or do we want to be doing
especially
relatively
Mexico,
well?
because they're on our border.
No, I know this is why Trump's stuff actually is so crazy with respect to Mexico. That's the country we have a very concrete interest in not having severe recessions and unemployment and so forth, right? But it's hard to explain that, I think. Yeah.
While we've been living in the United States in a period of increasing inequality, and therefore poverty rates in the United States have been fairly flat, really, for 40 years. But if you look at poverty around the world, it's actually a very different story. If you look at people living in very deep poverty, less than $2 a day, it has plummeted over the past 20, 30 years. So anybody who's worried, takes a global perspective and is worried about deeply poor people, the past 30 years has been a great time. Now, why is that? Well, it's mainly Asia. It's India and China to a large degree, because India and China have been doing fine, and they have a lot of people, and they're pulling a lot of people out of very deep poverty. So anybody who's really worried about the human condition should applaud the growth in India and China. The median working class American is not going to take much solace in the fact that there's a lot of Chinese workers being pulled out of poverty. But if you take any humanitarian impulse at all, it's not that bad a time for the global economy.
And not just humanitarian impulse, but Americans could take national pride in the fact that that's made, most of it's due to India and China, of course, that progress, but a lot of it's made possible, let's put it this way, by an American-led world economic and political system that has mostly preserved the peace, that has mostly allowed for the relatively free flow of capital and investment, which has made possible this massive movement of people out of poverty. So there's a way in which an American politician, I've always thought, and I think Clinton and Bush tried to do this in a way, more mainstream politicians, say this is something we should be proud of. It's not, and it is in our long-term interest not to have these countries collapsing, and it's something just a matter of mix of humanitarian and self-interest and just national kind of leadership pride.
Absolutely.
We should feel good about. But that disappeared in 2016. I think. I mean that.
It does, and it's funny. Having a president who's in favor of trade has a long tradition before this current election. Barack Obama, when he was a senator, wasn't particularly free trade in his voting record, but then he got in. He negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And my guess is if Hillary Clinton got elected,
Right.
she would have pivoted toward being more of a free trader than she actually talked about during the campaign. So while there's always been a lot of angst about trade, and particularly in Congress, the president is usually the grown-up in the room who sort of sees the bigger picture and usually counted on to promote a free trade agenda, and that goes across party lines. It's still be seen what Donald Trump is going to do. I mean, it's still early as we speak, but so far it looks like he's much more skeptical about free trade than any of his recent predecessors.
And how worrying is that to you, just as a pure kind of economics matter? I mean, how much damage would lack of further progress or some regress on free trade bring?
I think it would be bad for the U.S. economy. It would shrink the U.S. economy. I really do believe that trade expands the size of the economic pie. It might even be worse for some other countries because they're smaller. I mean, we're kind of big, so we can sort of nobody's threatening free trade among the 50 states.
Right.
So we could benefit.
And trade is what, 10, 12% or something like that of GDP.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. So it's small compared to in the U.S. compared to smaller countries. But to the extent that we shut off smaller countries from trade, and to the extent that some of these populous and smaller countries follow our example by becoming more isolationist, that could be very bad for the developing world. So. There's a lot of history of sort of countries looking inward and suffering from, Argentina being the famous example. But I think it's particularly worrisome when the United States sort of starts looking inward and stops engaging in the rest of the world, because people are going to look to us as an example, and we can be either a good example or a bad example. And if we look too inward, then that's going to provide a bad example for a lot of economic policies worldwide.
And some people say, well, look, we're not going to become a real protectionist country. We're not going back to the 19th century. We're not going to have massive tariffs. Probably. I think that's probably correct. Congress, that I think there wouldn't be support for, and American business would rally against that and so forth. I mean, probably. And so we're just talking about some individual, industries and goods, and sort of a little bit of showmanship by Trump to please the people who voted for him, and don't worry too much about it. It's a small percentage of the economy. Is that right, or is there kind of a ripple effect though, where even a little bit of, of that can go a long way in terms of doing some damage?
Well, I'm naturally an optimist, so my feeling is that this is going to be some bread and circuses, but at the end of the day, the grown-ups in the room will get together and sort of recognize that really, if you want to preserve the success of the U.S. and the world economies, that sticking to free trade principles is a good thing. On the other hand, the world's very hard to predict. A year ago, I didn't predict that Trump would end up president. So I am perfectly ready to be surprised and to find retreat to more economic isolationist view. Some things requires congressional approval, like if you really have massive tariffs everywhere. But some things can be done with through enforcement. I mean, there's things like anti-dumping rules that the president can enforce more vigorously, and slap retaliatory tariffs on when he views foreigners as selling too cheaply here. And my own view, by the way, of anti-dumping is the laws are just terrible laws, and so if he's going to more vigorously enforce bad laws, that's not a step in the right direction. I've written in the past about how I'd really like to see the anti-dumping laws eliminated or radically reformed, because a lot of the cases of anti-dumping are just really protectionism by another name, and so I'm kind of nervous that this Congress has over the years ceded so much authority to the president, who now seems to want to use it in a more protectionist way than previous presidents.
But I guess the idea was, in a way, that Congress could get credit for protecting its local businesses with these anti-dumping laws, and then the president would not really enforce them the way Congress intended. So everyone gets, Congress gets to say we did our best and blame the president, and the president makes sure the economy isn't.
That's right. The president is supposed to be the person who has the bigger picture, and traditionally, both under George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, that was a more internationalist picture.
Right.
It's not so clear whether that's going to be true now. We don't know. It's still to be determined.
And do you think there's I guess what I'm struck by like TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, a lot of intelligent economists thought the deal was kind of a mixed bag. It's not really that free trade. There's like thousands of pages of specifications, and we already have massive trade with most of these countries, and all we're doing is keeping the status quo. After all, we're not putting up tariffs. So I made that argument to someone intelligent, who made the argument back, well, but this is a little, I mean, to use a cliche, the bicycle thing, either you're going forward or back or not. I mean, it's not so, just the rejection of it and the signaling of some of what Trump and Sanders, for that matter, are signaling can have a sort of snowballing effect, or it can get out of control, even though it looks concretely that in 2017, I'm just going to predict this knowing nothing about it, trade between the U.S. and Japan and the U.S. and Australia is going to be the same, as it was in 2016, presumably. Yeah. I mean, the rules haven't changed. Right. There's no reason it would decrease. That somehow the psychology and the sort of, lesson of rejecting TPP and then toying with various anti-dumping measures and stuff can have a bit of a, escalating kind of effect. Is that true?
No, I think that's right. And you see it sort of in small ways, like when he approved the pipeline and required that all the pipes be manufactured in the United States, right? Until you realize later that actually they don't make those kind of pipes in the United States. So,
is that right?
Yeah.
So the Keystone Pipeline, which was such a big Republican kind of talking point,
yeah,
right?
so that's the pipes. Actually, the piping, they'll be manufactured here, but the pipes themselves will be fabricated elsewhere. But I also worry that the Trump administration is to the extent that we're negotiating with foreign countries on trade, is often focused on the wrong things. So let's say China. He spent a lot of time talking about China's currency manipulation. And I don't think there are many economists who think that China's currency manipulation is the first order issue that we need to deal with. It's not a huge problem, even though certain industries may think it is. I think there are issues we need to negotiate with China on. So for one that I'm focused on myself is intellectual property protection. The United States is a country that produces a lot of intellectual property, whether it's software or movies or music or even economics textbooks, which I
get
sell
one
abroad.
Close to your heart.
I sell much close to my own heart.
To the Chinese, they've translated your textbook?
Well, it's funny. A Chinese student came to my office a few weeks ago, and she said, I brought you a copy of the Chinese translation of your book, which she got in the store. And I was very happy to get it. And she said, I think this is the official one. The store was selling 3 different translations.
Oh, great!
I wasn't sure which one is the official.
So you don't think you're not getting royalties on every
no, so I'm not
translation of your book.
It's not that much money. The prices are kind of low in China anyway, so I'll make a lot of money anyway. But I mean, this is sort of one example. There was
Disney's losing more money on the pirating of their films than you're losing on the pirating of your textbook.
Exactly. Yeah. There was a story in the New York Times this a few years ago when the authorities raided some Apple store in China. Which turned out wasn't an Apple store at all. They were selling fake Apple products, and their fake Apple products were so good replicas that even the salesman in the store thought they were working in a real Apple store. They didn't know they were pirated products. So we just produce lots of stuff that's heavy in intellectual content, and it's very easy for a country like China to free ride. Of saying we're not going to recognize your copyrights or patents and just sort of get off stuff for free, and that really, to me, is just like theft. I mean, if you're just not paying for, if you're taking stuff for free that other people are producing, that's a silly theft. So I think that's something we do need to deal with China on. I think currency manipulation is a secondary one.
If we dodge the bullet on trade, and it's sort of a fair amount of talk and drama, but fundamentally the world trading system stays pretty intact. And Trump called you up and said, "Well, you were there in the earlier Bush administration, and what are the biggest things that he could do to get that economy going, get our economy going from, let's say, 2% up back towards 3%? I mean, are there one or two silver bullets?
I don't think there's any silver bullet. I don't think there's no silver bullet, but I think there are things we can do. I think a lighter touch on regulation would be a good thing, and he's talked about that. I think his saying when he's going to eliminate 2 regulations for every one he adds is a little simplistic, but
it's in the right direction. I suppose, right?
But I think thinking hard about regulations and moving in a slightly more libertarian direction there, I think would be a good thing. I think tax reform would be a good thing, and actually I quite like the tax reform plan that the House Republicans are looking at, the so-called border adjustable cash flow tax, which is a mouthful. But if you actually look at the nuts and bolts of it, it's actually a pretty good tax reform. And I think that would help promote economic growth here. I think that would discourage corporate inversions. So I think that tax reform would be a step in the right direction. Even if you did all the things I wanted to do, I don't think you're going to get growth from 2 to 4, which he's talked about, in part because my generation of baby boomers is retiring, and the fact there's to be fewer people in the workforce. In the previous generations, the baby boomers was entering the workforce. Women were entering the workforce. Well, they're already in the workforce. They're not going to enter again. And so the combination that the women's movement is sort of plateaued, and baby boomers are now ready to move to Fort Lauderdale and play shuffleboard, means that we're going to have lower labor force growth, and therefore getting total GDP growth up to 4 is going to be very unlikely in that environment.
So I guess that gets back to the earlier point of maybe we had an extraordinary 30, 40 years of
Yes.
a baby boom, extremely well-educated
Right.
component of the adult population that had not traditionally much been in the workforce coming in, which is a very big plus, right? I mean,
That's right.
They're
Absolutely.
educated anyway.
And having women coming in,
Right.
highly educated women in many cases.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you don't get that again.
Absolutely.
I guess the closest you get to that is well-educated immigrants coming in.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think that's.
So let's talk about that, since that's the other Trump thing,
Yeah.
Trump issue.
I mean, yeah. Well, immigration is complicated,
Right.
Because it has not only economic issues but a lot of non-economic issues. From my perspective, you need to distinguish between sort of high-skilled immigrants and low-skilled immigrants. The low-skilled immigrants are complicated because if they come in, there's still gains from trade, and I think that sort of immigration is a good thing, but they probably do compete with other low-skilled Americans, and therefore could put a depressing effect on wages at the bottom end of the distribution. So I think if people worry about inequality, you can kind of understand why a massive increase in low-skilled immigrants was going to concern them. At the end of the day, I tend to be more favorable to low-skilled immigrants in part because the person who's impacted the most by this is the immigrant themselves. And coming to the United States is a great thing, and most of us, including certainly me, has benefited greatly from the ability of immigrants to come in. My grandparents came over here 100 years ago. None of them had more than a 4th grade education. So I'm sure they competed with then low-skilled Americans. It's probably depressed wages of low-skilled Americans. But because of that decision of letting us in, I'm now a professor at Harvard, and I'm doing pretty well. So I have a lot of sympathy for them, based on personal history. But I understand how there's another side of that coin. The high-skilled immigrants is a completely different story. It's like nuts to me that we don't let as many high-skilled immigrants in as want to come. I mean, as long as we do sort of the proper vetting, make sure they're not terrorists, they're going to come here, and they're going to certainly pay more in taxes than they're collecting in social services. They're going to create firms that will then hire a bunch of Americans. So if you hire a bunch of engineers from India, come here, they're going to create a new firm, an engineering firm. Who they're going to hire? They're going to hire a bunch of janitors, and that's going to bid up the wages of the janitors, or presumably Americans. So letting more skilled people in here is a no-brainer to me. At Harvard, we have a lot of foreign students.
Right.
And some of them go home, and I think when they go home, that's fine. They sort of bring American values with them abroad. But to the extent they want to stay here, we should encourage that. I mean, every diploma should come with a green card if they want it. Because if once you got a degree from a top American university, you are going to contribute a lot, regardless of where you were born. And the fact that we're making it hard for people now under the current immigration system is just nuts.
I mean, how suboptimal is the current system? I mean, leave aside Trump for a minute, just the system that's been in place for a while. I mean, are we just leaving a huge amount of sort of potential innovation and economic growth on the table with that, or is it sort of marginal and it's whatever?
I think it's not hard to know. I actually think that's probably pretty important. I mean, I think industries vary in terms of how much difficulty they face. I'd say about probably a third of my colleagues in the Harvard Economics Department were born abroad. We hire a lot of assistant professors every year, and many of them are not American-born. Harvard manages to help them navigate through the immigration system. So it's pretty rare that we hire an assistant professor that can't eventually figure out a way to stay. I get the sense that, though, in Silicon Valley and some other industries, it's not as sure. And it's much harder to sort of navigate through the H-1B process. And I think it's unambiguously a bad thing. Trying to figure out the magnitude of that, it's hard to calibrate, but I think the direction is absolutely clear.
And people look at Harvard and Silicon Valley, and they don't look at the sort of more, the less glamorous, you might say, people who could be coming in and working in, mid-level firms and hospitals and all kinds of places, where it's very hard to see. I sort of agree with you. I'm assuming they can be assimilated and there aren't sort of cultural and social, negative effects. And there are probably some positive effects. There certainly are some positive effects too, as these people are in a way more, don't take things for granted, and their kids work harder and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, just looking at, how could it be a negative to have those people? I mean, they as you say, they're almost all going to work. They're not going to be unemployed, and they're going to pay more in taxes, aren't they? They're going to
absolutely
consume in benefits. So
absolutely. I mean, if you look at our long-term fiscal imbalance, which we still have,
right.
We're going to have to figure out ways to either raise more revenue or cut government spending. And the simplest way to raise more revenue is get more smart people in here who are paying more taxes because they're earning more income. So to me, that's like really a no-brainer.
Another thing that's got me worried is, the degree to which people have decided, well, all that talk about entitlements and law and debt and, that it's unsustainable, which I got to say, I think Republicans and Paul Ryan did a lot to sort of, with some heavy lifting, it's not politically the easiest thing in the world. They frankly just got the whole party on that page, and Democrats were a little more hesitant, but some of them were close, That's been a big setback, I think. We now have a Republican president who's, forget about Medicare and Social Security. The Democrats are never going to be the party that, I suspect, takes the lead on that. So here we are, and how worried should we be about that? Is that just something we can kick down the road, or is there a real chance of a...
Well, we can kick it down the road, but the farther we kick it down the road, the fewer the options we have. So my preferred solution would be to focus on the spending side of those programs and then encourage people to prepare for their own retirement by, say, saving more in our IRAs and so on, maybe working longer, later retirement ages. The alternative is we kick the can down the road when the whole baby boom is retired and we don't have the money to pay for it. It's probably going to be politically impossible to, at that point, say we're going to cut the spending because people have counted on their benefits and they're already sort of a retirement age. And so then the only solutions we're going to have left is raising taxes. And that's actually, I think, one of the reasons why some Democratic commentators don't mind kicking the can down the road, because they realize that'll sort of box the nation into what they want, which is a robust social safety net with higher taxes. They want to move us in the direction of Western Europe. And I'm worried about moving in the direction of Western Europe because I believe that the higher taxes in Western Europe are one of the reasons that the economies aren't as rich as we are, and why people don't work as much in Western Europe as they do in the United States. So I think that's in some sense the path we're looking at. And the way I put it to my students at Harvard is I say, look, my generation of baby boomers have promised us a certain level of retirement benefits in terms of Social Security and Medicare, and we've promised that you're going to pay for it. Yeah, right. How do you feel about that? And if we get to the point where I'm 70 years old and therefore my benefits are untouchable politically, then there's no question that my students, when they're my age, will be facing taxes more like we see in France and Germany today.
Now, there's sort of a sophisticated argument that I've heard, maybe it's partly true, I don't know, I'm curious if it is, that, well, that sounds like we're switching the burden to the younger generation, but concretely, you're getting benefits you probably don't need. You'll be getting them in 20 years that you don't need, and your kids will be paying taxes to support that, but then you're leaving that money to your kids anyway. So leaving aside complications of, state tax rates and stuff, aren't we just, does it really matter that much? Aren't we just sort of recycling the money?
Well, I think for people at the top, that's right. For people who are leaving bequests to their kids and inheritances are a big thing, I think that's right. In fact, there's a whole theory called Ricardian equivalence. It's all about how these things don't really matter because families can make transfers among themselves across generations and sort of undo whatever the government does. But that's I don't think true for the vast majority of people. I mean, inheritance is maybe a big thing in my family and your family, but it's probably not for the median American who's not getting a lot from their parents' inheritance. So it really does. There is sort of a very important issue of how we share the fiscal burden across generations.
And so the working class family is in a way right to be worried that either the pension and Medicare and stuff they were hoping for is going to get more constrained or limited or cut, or their kids are going to pay higher taxes for it. But one or the other.
Yes. And if I had to guess, to be honest, I'd say it's probably going to be higher taxes because we haven't really shown the political will to ask people to get ready for themselves for their own retirement. In fact, if Donald Trump decided to run on I'm not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, does sort of indicate that that's the politically winning position right now. Among economists, by the way, when you poll people about different solutions, later retirement ages poll pretty well among professional economists. Among the general public, it doesn't poll very well at all. People hate the idea of later retirement ages. I mean, my view is that since we're living longer asking people to work a few years longer seems to be the most humane way. Because I think higher taxes would adversely affect the economy. You really can't cut benefits much for an 85, 90-year-old.
Right.
So the easiest thing is to ask the 60-year-old to work to 65 or 68. But the public doesn't like that at all. So it's easy to say when you're a tenured professor. It's harder to say if you're a congressman having to get reelected every 2 years.
How worried, I guess, this is sort of a stupid question. It's obviously it's no simple answer, but I mean, you could take the point of view, this is such a massive nation, huge economy. The government isn't that big a part of it. The government can screw a lot of things up, and at the end of the day, the thing chugs along, and maybe it chugs along at 2.1% instead of 2.3%. But I mean, basically, it is what it is, kind of thing. And unless they just wildly go off the rails, we'll be okay and have the normal business cycle and all this. Versus, you add up the different things we're talking about: trade, immigration, not dealing with entitlements, a few other foolish policies. Well, I want to get to this other one, which would be, sort of government picking individual companies and pressuring them, and that sort of Argentina-type behavior. And could it really mess things up, I guess is what I'm saying. I mean, how much does one have
I'm optimistic that it won't, in the sense that I do believe in our system of checks and balances. So even if we had a president who wanted to sort of screw things up, I'm optimistic that he couldn't or she couldn't. So at the end of the day, I'm probably more optimistic than pessimistic. On the other hand, I don't say that with 100% confidence, because it's not true that the economy is so big that it's robust to anything. I mean,
and I guess the issue's on the margin, right?
Yeah, exactly. The question is whether it's marginal stuff or whether he's going to really do big bad stuff. I mean, whenever students say, how much does policy matter? I say, look at North Korea versus South Korea, right? They're basically two identical countries. One's very rich, one's extremely poor. That's all policy, right? East Germany versus West Germany. So we have examples where when policy is really bad, things get really bad economically.
Argentina, which was once as wealthy as West Europe, right?
Yes, exactly. So there's no question that bad policy can be really bad. Or even Venezuela now. I mean, right? I mean, Venezuela's got one of the biggest oil reserves in the world. How could they possibly be as impoverished as they are? I mean, it's kind of nuts.
Yeah.
So really bad policy can be really bad. My guess is I give more credit to Donald Trump than that. Plus, I also think that to the extent he had bad impulses, he's going to be checked by Congress. I think the Republican leadership has instincts that are much closer to mine. My guess is, in his heart of hearts, Paul Ryan and I probably agree a lot more than Paul Ryan agrees with Donald Trump. So I think in the end of the day, he and Mitch McConnell will provide the right checks and balances that we need. But I'm ready to be proven wrong.
And fairly bad policies, can slow things down, but hopefully not really tip you over. I mean, there's not a tipping point problem where you
I don't think the economy is more continuous than that. I don't think there's like a tipping point where you just do this a little bit more of this and all of a sudden the avalanche
some
goes.
People think. Yeah, okay.
No,
good.
I don't see that. No, I'd be quite surprised if anything like that happened.
And how worried should one be about the individual company, the sort of browbeating or the opposite of individual companies and the kind of just moving in that direction where the President of the United States, in a way that I think was pretty inconceivable almost 5, 10, 15 years ago, starts to, pick on companies and war. And
well, that's right. Whenever I think of, see that in practice, I think of a famous paper by Friedrich Hayek called The Role of Knowledge in Society, which basically says that information is very, very dispersed among the population of consumers and businesses. Nobody can possibly know all the information you need to run a centrally planned economy. And therefore, you really can't have any central planner, president, or anybody else say, this firm should be opening up this plant in this location, or not closing this plant and not moving it here. That's why we try to trust markets. These markets figure out a way to aggregate in a decentralized way, disperse information into desirable outcomes. And whenever a president tries to intervene in that process, he's going to make mistakes because he doesn't know how the economy should be run. He doesn't know what plant should go where. So it's basically short-circuiting the market mechanism and taking a step toward central planning. And I think, again, if you'll go back to sort of North versus South Korea, I think we know that central planning really works badly. Now, my guess is Donald Trump's going to only do a little bit of this. It's mainly for show than it is because he's really going to expect to micromanage every company in the United States. But it's certainly a step in a very bad direction.
And how much do you worry about the flip side of it, which I'm sure I don't know the right terms for this, but that companies start to behave in a different way because they expect or fear rewards, I guess, sort of rent-seeking versus, market-driven investment or something like that.
Well, I think that's exactly right. But it's not because, and I presume that's the implication of Trump. He doesn't want to. He's trying to threaten some companies, so other companies will make decisions that he likes.
Right.
I think ultimately they should be making decisions that are in the interest of their shareholders. That's their fiduciary obligation, not decisions that will please happen to be elected to the Oval Office at this moment. So I think that is.
And you have real economic costs if you start making decisions the other way, right? I mean, you just
absolutely
you do lose.
Because I mean, to the extent you're not moving to the right place, not only your shareholders are losing out, but your customers are losing out because they're paying higher prices, and therefore that's reducing living standards not only for shareholders but for all Americans.
Yes, let's just talk a little more broadly about the whole question of sort of economics and the truths of economics, markets, what's sometimes derided as, under the Washington consensus, neoliberal consensus. I'd say, in my experience, I'm very curious though what you think about this. It's become almost unfashionable just to have the conventional orthodox view that markets really do work better than central planning, that you really don't want to politicize everything, that a rising tide may not lift all boats, but it lifts more boats than not, and that it's a heck of a lot better than a non-rising tide. Right. I mean, all these things, now everyone begins with the opposite, right? Well, we have to stipulate that there are losers from trade and the rising tide isn't enough, and that you need government interventions. And I'm just curious, how worried are you that a sort of kind of hard-won over 70 years, pretty reasonable consensus that really you could argue has served the world pretty well in terms of economic policy is at risk?
Oh, I am worried. I mean, I think that consensus among economists hasn't changed among economists. I don't think economists have changed their view of how the world works, and that sort of neoliberalism that you referred to is still very much the consensus among mainstream economists. It's certainly what I teach in introductory economics at Harvard, and I think if you look at other sort of schools,
it wouldn't be that different.
It wouldn't be that different if you went anywhere else.
And the behavioral economics and all that stuff is.
Well, I think behavioral economics has become part of the canon.
But it's a modification, really,
exactly.
Right? It's not a fundamental.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. But I don't think the public at large is as convinced, in part because of the disturbing trends of lower growth and rising inequality. There are disturbing trends, but they somehow think that therefore they need to rethink sort of the basics of economics. And most economists disagree with that, even though they agree with the trends. Now, part of the answer is that most people haven't studied economics. Most high school students have never seen an economics course, and therefore they sort of read the paper and they make assumptions based on everyday experience, which is not necessarily the best way to learn. Now, I'm actually a big believer that we should be teaching introductory economics in high schools more. We require every 11th grader roughly to take a year of American history because we think a year of American history is required to be a good citizen, and I think that makes perfect sense. I also think a year of economics is sort of useful to become a good citizen, and there's nothing in introductory economics, as I teach it, that couldn't be taught to 11th, 12th graders. It doesn't really use any more advanced math than most people know in 9th grade. Mm-hmm. So it really could be taught at the high school level, but it's not done nearly enough.
And people take the innovations for granted. It's great that we have the iPhone and all that, but how exactly did that happen, right?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the production chain of something like the iPhone or most complicated products, they're being produced all over the world,
right?
And we really are better off than we were 100 years ago, even though we're maybe not growing as fast as our aspirations were set when we were children.
And produced because innovation's very highly rewarded, even if it increases inequality. And,
that's right.
And a lot of people fail. A lot of companies were close on the iPhone and didn't quite have the right one, or just got unlucky, frankly. And and those guys lost money. And people really don't, I think, appreciate.
Yeah, and we live in a economy where superstars do dominate a little bit more than in the past.
Right.
The example I used to use is Robert Downey Jr., who for the movie The Avengers made $50 million, which is just an astonishing sum of money. The typical American needs to work for more than 1,000 years to make $50 million. So how did Robert Downey Jr. make $50 million? He did it by making a really good movie that got seen by roughly 200 million people worldwide, and each person who bought a ticket basically paid 25 cents to go watch Robert Downey Jr. But I guess they didn't really mind paying the 25 cents, right. But he managed to sort of sell to 200 million, his service to 200 million people, and even if for only a quarter, that adds up pretty fast. Similarly, there's a lot of parts of the economy where technology has allowed people to reach wide audiences and therefore reap tremendous rewards. Whether you're Taylor Swift or you're a famous baseball player, or you're Steve Jobs selling your iPhone around the world, technology has sort of allowed people to reach very, very large markets.
But yeah, so.
But it's a good thing. I mean,
Right.
those people who paid 25 cents to Robert Downey Jr. were probably happy. Did they say, if you asked them when they left the movie theater, did you mind paying 25 cents for that performance? They say, no, it was great. I love that movie. It's
Right.
a great movie. So even though Robert Downey Jr. gets rich, that doesn't mean other people are necessarily getting poor. It's creating value. And similarly with the iPhone and Taylor Swift's music and all sorts of other sort of superstars.
I suppose one could tinker with marginal tax rates and reduce inequality a bit, right? I mean,
You could to some
it's
to
not
some
gonna
degree. It's
fundament-
not going to be huge. I mean, and then we get back to this classic trade-off in economics, which is between equality and efficiency. There's this famous Arthur Oken book, Equality and Efficiency: The Big Trade-Off,
right.
which maybe we think of as equality versus growth. So we could either use the tax code to promote economic growth, or we could use the tax code to produce more equality. But you probably can't do both. And so we have these two problems of sort of slow growth and rising inequality, and the tax system by itself is the imperfect instrument because you can't really address both simultaneously. Which gets us back to education, which is probably one of the few tools we have that can promote both simultaneously. More educated workforce can both have us grow more quickly and produce more equality.
How much of that, I want to ask about that, then come back in a way to the neoliberal economics question and sort of, but on the is it education, or is it, how much of it is sort of the Charles Murray, Bob Putnam, family breakup, community breakup? I mean, is it really literally that people don't know skill A, B, and C? They don't read quickly enough or don't know math at a 12th grade level instead of a 9th grade level? Or is it that their lives are sort of chaotic because of things, beyond their control when they're young, but unfortunately they don't turn out quite the way, kids brought up in a hardworking two-parent family that's stable and so forth, in a community that rewards hard work, et cetera. I mean, how worried are you about that? That's beyond.
Well, I
don't
am
know
worried
what
about
to do
that.
about it, but
I think that the Putnam, Charles Murray stuff is extremely well taken. I love their stuff. It's particularly hard to figure out as cause and effect. What's the causal thing? What's the effect? It's probably true that being brought up in a single parent family is more difficult and doesn't lead you to as good economic outcomes. On the other hand, it could be that the reduced economic opportunities for people at the bottom has caused the breakup. One economist, David Otter, was once describing this as saying, "Look, if you're a woman, a less educated woman now, so you have a couple kids out of wedlock, and you're raising them, do you really want to get married? That's just another mouth to feed. If your husband doesn't really have good job opportunities, he's not really contributing. He's just he's one more person you need to take care of. So it's unclear sort of which way causation runs in that. I certainly think it's not a good thing that we have let's say lower marriage rates, especially among less educated people. But it's not clear that focusing on that as the problem is the right answer.
And how much of the problem do you think is sort of, this is the old Charles Murray argument back in the 80s, of the kind of, what's it called, the wage trap or the wedge? I mean,
the poverty trap.
Poverty trap, rather, sort of that this benefits make it not worth your while to take a lower paid job, even though 15 years from now, if you start with a lower paid job, you'll have a moderately paid job. If you never start, you never get the moderately paid job.
I think that remains a concern. I'm a big believer that marginal tax rates do matter, and that's marginal tax rates for both rich and the poor.
Right.
And for the poor, the marginal tax rates take the form of benefits that phase out very quickly, and therefore you have very little incentive to earn more. So I think when we design social welfare programs, I think that makes a lot of sense. I actually like Charles Murray's more recent work on sort of a basic living income. And then saying we should sort of replace a lot of our social safety net programs with like sort of guaranteed income that phases out at a plausible rate, so people aren't disincentivized to advance their own living standard.
Yeah, I've come to be more friendlier to that too. I just think because it does seem like the complex of programs now, partly because of the phase outs, partly just because maybe once you're on them, you're sort of worried about losing something if you step off, and it's complex, and that probably traps people a little more than disability, food, all these different programs somehow. One has the sense, I haven't seen much, I haven't studied it, so that there's less mobility out of that than there should be somehow.
Yes, I agree, and I think rethinking that is an important priority.
Well, maybe that'll happen somehow in Congress and the like. Getting back to the broader question of the sort of the neoliberal consensus. I guess I am struck just what Orwell said. I think the restatement, and sometimes the restatement of the truth is, of the obvious is the most important thing you can do. And I kind of feel that way. That somehow you feel a little silly making the case for markets. It's like, really? This has been made so much more powerfully and eloquently by much smarter people over decades and centuries. But it does seem like people just don't get the most basic arguments for why you want to have a society which is somewhat impersonal in its rule of law, and which markets, for all their deficiencies, drive things instead of individuals, making decisions about what they like and don't like in terms of political preference and rent seeking. Just these kind of pretty commonsensical things. I don't know. What's your take on that?
I agree. I always think of the basic idea being that decentralized decision making is usually the best decision making when you don't have one person trying to make decisions for lots of other people because they don't have full information. People making decisions for their own lives, their own communities, are most likely to make the best decisions. And what the central government can do, the federal government, is basically establish the rule of law, establish parameters under which people are making these decisions. But the specific decisions they're making are something they leave to individuals. And the more we decentralize that from the federal government to the state government to the local government, the better the decisions are likelier to be. I think there's a tendency in our system to do the opposite, of moving more and more decisions to the federal level, thinking that people in Washington thinking that they're smarter than the people in the localities, and therefore they'll make better decisions. Even if they are smarter, that could make worse decisions. We just don't have the information, and what's good for one community is going to be different from another community. So I'm a big believer in the decentralized market. I'm also a big believer in federalism, really for the same reason, that I want to decentralize power to the lowest level I can, because that's where people are most likely to make the best decisions. It's also where competition is going to rule. One of the reasons that markets work is because competition. If one company tries to screw you, you can just go to another company. If one town is trying to screw you, you can move to a different town. So I think that the competition is the essence of why Adam Smith thought markets worked, because not that he thought that businesses were always noble, he just thought that because they were competing against one another, that provided the most important check and balance. And similarly, that's why I think I trust local governments more than I trust federal governments, because it's much easier to move from one town to the next than it is to leave the country.
Right. And the rule of law, I think that's underestimated, don't you think, in allowing for sound economy and sound economic growth.
Oh, absolutely.
We're in the Argentina type situation, and Venezuela and whatever.
That's right. The John Adams quote about we're a nation of laws, not of men, I think is tremendously important. And so when Donald Trump says, "Oh, I don't like this air conditioning plan to move," he's basically saying, no, there wasn't any law being broken. There's no rule. Right. He's just saying, I don't like it. And all of a sudden, we're no longer an economy of laws and rules, or an economy of one particular man who's making judgment calls over a situation that he's not necessarily an expert at.
And this is where I guess I do think there could be some tipping point problem, which is not literally in the sense that, we could capsize into some massive depression. But if Trump thinks he can do that, then every governor thinks he can do that. They already think they can do that a little bit insanely. Yes. But they tend to do it more generally. I want to keep businesses in my state, and they'll reward businesses. Maybe they shouldn't, that say they're going to leave the state. But they tend still not to bludgeon individual people quite as much. But if Trump thinks he can do it, senators think they do it, congressmen think they can do it, suddenly you're sort of in a system where it sort of escalates the erosion of the kind of notion of an impersonal rule of law and impersonal market forces and so forth.
It does, and it centralizes power really too much in government officials. So we need government just because the government is the one thing that's the monopolies over force in the society. But because it has a monopolies over force, that's a tremendous amount of power. And so we want to sort of circumscribe that a lot. People sort of worry about corporate power. I almost never worry about corporate power because almost every corporation is being competed with. If I don't like my Apple phone, I go to Samsung. Whereas there's very little. There's no alternatives when there's centralized power in government. So I think centralized governmental power to me is much more of a threat to freedoms and prosperity than is centralized corporate power.
We're speaking, I guess, 2 weeks into the Trump administration, and I guess the odds are whatever, life will go on one way or the other, and less upside than maybe Trump supporters think, and less downside than Trump skeptics think. But what is there sort of a real worrisome scenario? Not insane. Obviously anything could happen, sort of a 1% kind of thing. But what would your sort of negative, really worry? What would your plausibly worrisome scenario be over the next years?
If I had to sort of describe a dystopian future, which I don't expect, by the way, but if I had to describe a dystopian future, it would go something like this. It would be Donald Trump gets all his bills and big infrastructure spending and big tax cuts. He replaces Janet Yellen at the Fed, which he said he's going to do, with somebody who's more beholden to Donald Trump. The big tax cuts and the spending increases demand, and inflation starts heating up. Trump leans on his Fed chair not to raise interest rates to fight this because people don't really like raising interest rates. Inflation starts heating up. Trump doesn't like inflation heating up. He goes back and says, what can we do about that? He looks back to Richard Nixon. He says, wage and price controls. If I can tell the carrier plant not to move out, I can tell the carrier plant not to raise their prices, and then I can start telling this union not to raise their wages. And then all of a sudden we've slowly stumbled into central planning, which we know works terribly.
Which worked politically for Nixon in 72. I mean, he did these very, I think we now would say, irresponsible things in 71 and bludgeoned Arthur Burns to do them or whatever, and got himself reelected handily in 72.
Yes,
no,
that's right.
Extremely
It worked.
nasty recession. In
it worked temporarily,
right?
And then it stopped working when they stopped doing it. And he couldn't keep doing it because you can't have the government controlling all wages and prices in the economy. It was untenable. And I think even the economic advisors to Richard Nixon at the time, people like Alan Greenspan, knew this was stupid policy.
Yeah.
I mean, they knew it was kind of nuts. But they did it anyway.
I mean, I guess one argument, this is a more sort of fancier argument for markets, is they do sort of internalize a long-term perspective as well as a short-term perspective, whereas precisely this Nixon example, his incentives were short-term. I mean, didn't help him in 73, 74 to have a big recession, but you always, if you're a politician, you can always put off thinking about that. And sometimes you can push that back to your successor's time in office, presumably, whereas markets do somehow, I think, at least in theory, right? I mean, can look over the horizon and be worried about the longer-term effects of policies.
I think that's right. And I mean, the 73, 74 was also associated with OPEC,
right.
and so on. So there were sort of external forces. I don't want to blame it all on Richard Nixon, but the Richard Nixon example, I think, is an example where an authoritarian president who was looking out for his own political self-interest poses policies that we know are bad, that we know by his own advisors were bad, and that we know from history are bad, and that sort of moves you in the direction of these sort of authoritarian third world regimes that really never end well. I mean, authoritarian populists tend to move in this direction, and I'm hopeful that Trump was not going to do that. I suspect the people around him will be smart enough to tell him not to. But if you had to describe a dystopian future, I think it would look something like that.
That's good. I feel like we shouldn't end on that note. So let's describe an optimistic future. I mean, what you basically,
Well, I think there's some. I mean, I think there are certain good forces going on right now. I think the move toward a lighter touch on regulation is a good thing. I think that some of the tax reforms are a good thing. So I think, to the extent that
seems like in some areas, more broadly speaking, technological breakthroughs could really be. That's been frustrating in some areas. Like I would say that in medicine, biomedicine, that stuff has been slower than people might have said 30 or 40 years ago if people said how little progress we made in some of these
That's
diseases.
right. And
but you sort of feel like maybe it could be tipping in some of these places,
yes,
right?
Yes. I mean, there are, as we talked earlier about Bob Gordon's a technological pessimist, there are economists who are technological optimists about the future. Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT thinks we're on the verge of a new technological revolution with all these things that are going to be just amazing. I mean, think of driverless cars. I mean, it's going to be tough. If we have driverless cars and driverless trucks, that's going to be hard for people who are displaced from being taxi drivers and truck drivers. But that's going to free up a lot of resources that people can go do other things. That's a huge technological breakthrough, given all the time people spend driving.
Right.
So you can imagine that there will be new technologies over the horizon.
I mean, an Uber-type economy just seems to me in a sort of obvious way to help with lots of things, right? Congestion, climate change, if you care about that.
Yes.
I mean, if you're very worried about that, I mean, you can make a case that some of these breakthroughs, that's obviously made possible by the computer and by, the ability to get these cars in 2 minutes, to show up and have and that is such that you'd think for young people love Uber, and you think that if there's ever been an illustration of a non-centrally planned, I mean, obviously they're very smart people running Uber who figured this out, so there's a certain amount of central planning, you would say.
All corporations are in some sense centrally planned within the corporation.
Right, but the essence of it is there are millions of Americans driving cars around who have some time on their hands, and
Uber's the market maker.
And
basically.
now we can, thanks to technology, know exactly where they are and put them in touch with the person who wants to ride somewhere.
Absolutely. No, I think
price it appropriately, and that's sort of an amazing, should be an amazing net plus to an economy where one had to have a personal car parked somewhere, et cetera, or a driver or something.
Absolutely. In fact, in the new edition of my textbook that came out 2 months ago, in the first chapter, I have a new case study on Uber.
No.
And it's called "Adam Smith Would Have Loved Uber" is the title
I
of
should
it.
look at that
Because I think it really is exactly that. It's the sort of the market working to match suppliers and demanders in a decentralized way, a way that prices adjust, supply and demand, which it couldn't with taxis, which is just a tremendous resource.
And a real net positive for the economy, I assume.
Absolutely.
But I think also for people's lives. I mean, people say, oh, Uber, it's just like, it's convenient, it's great, we can walk out of here and get it. But, for people who are 1 a.m., have to go somewhere or in a not-so-great neighborhood, for people who've had too much to drink, college students, and don't want to, now the old days, they get
my
some
25-year-old daughter, is single, lives by herself. The fact that she has Uber is just amazing. Because, wherever she is, she knows she can get home safely.
Yeah.
In a
It's
short
a real
order.
benefit. It's not just a, marginal economic
It's huge.
benefit. Okay, you've cheered me up on that note. On that note, let me thank you, Greg Mankiw, for joining me today on Conversations. And thank you for joining us on Conversations.